that your Drahthaar is about 6 months of age, I would encourage you to think about starting the force fetch or trained retrieve process. This is where we teach the dog that every time we ask them to retrieve something, they must complete that retrieve. So at 6 months of age, your dog has all their adult teeth in, so they shouldn't have any issues with any soreness around the gums or the mouth. And most Drahthaars are physically and mentally mature enough to take additional pressure at this point with this more advanced training. So a couple things to consider before you start force fetch. While I like to start dogs at 6 months, I don't always do it. It depends on what time of year it is. I do not like to force fetch dogs during the hunting season. I don't want to create any confusion during retrieves during that. So if my dog turns 6 months during the hunting season, I generally wait until the day after hunting season to start force fetch. Sit. The other thing to think about is, do you have the time to commit to the training? Force fetch typically is something that you're going to be spending 5 to 30 minutes per day with your dog every single day for a few weeks until you finish the process. It might even take a month or 6 weeks depending on how mentally tough or soft your dog is. So with that being said, don't start force fetch unless you know you have the time to commit that every day. If you've got a 1-week vacation planned where you're going to be out of town in a few weeks, wait until after you return from that before you start force fetch. We want to be really consistent with this training. All right, so a lot of people have a training table. I've just never built one, so I always start on the floor with dogs. I just make sure I put down a rug so we have some good stable surface where he's not going to slip on the laminate flooring. And then when you start force fetch, I always just throw a little 4-foot lead on the dog, just because we're going to be reinforcing a lot of obedience commands. I make sure that I've got very basic training dummies to start with. I've just got all these small 2-inch ones that are really easy for the dog to retrieve. Make sure you have multiple dummies on hand. I found that if you start training with one dummy and you have to apply some additional pressure, it's really handy to then switch to a new dummy, and then the dog will often respond a little differently. It's easier for them to switch gears and retrieve if it's a new dummy that they haven't had any pressure on. And then as you're just rotating through the dummies, they just learn that much more quickly that your fetch command applies to anything and everything you're holding in front of them. So as we work through the force fetch process, we'll introduce Enzo to many, many different types of dummies. We'll introduce Dawkins of all sizes, just some other brands that have just some different shapes and sizes, so he gets used to all that. We'll introduce him to dummies that already have fur and feathers taped on them, and then eventually we'll transition into retrieving actual game. We also want to make sure we've got treats. So I always have just a cheap little treat pouch. You can purchase these at any pet supply store. And because dog treats are kind of expensive, what I prefer to do instead of buying dog treats is I just buy a big block of Colby Monterey Jack cheese from Walmart, and I just cut it up into little cubes. This works as a great treat. I have yet to find a dog that doesn't love eating cheese cubes as a reward. So I'm going to film this very first force fetch session with Enzo. He turned 6 months old last week, so this will be his first experience with this type of training. I'm not going to film his entire series just because honestly it takes more time to set up the camera and edit and upload the videos than it does to actually do the training. So I've already produced a film series with my previous Drahthaar. So after this, I would encourage you to check out that video series if you're interested in step-by-step instructions on daily training sessions to force fetch your dog. But I at least wanted to just show this very first session with Enzo so you can see a start, and because we've been using him throughout the rest of this puppy introduction series. All right, so before we get started today, I would like to remind you that every time I start force fetch with a new dog, I start with 4 objectives, 4 training objectives that I would like to achieve through our session today. So the first thing is that I want to introduce my dog to hold. Some people teach hold as a command. I don't really use it as a separate command, but rather I just want to condition them to this idea of once they've grasped something in their mouth, they need to retain a hold on it until I give a release command. So I might say hold, but again, it's not really a command. Similar to how if you put a dog on a sit, you shouldn't always have to say stay, it's implied. So eventually we're going to say fetch, and then the hold is implied, so I don't teach it as a separate command. But again, they need to get used to just holding something in their mouth. Another big objective today is to build up the dog's expectation, or to teach them that they're going to receive a food reward every time they hold that dummy until I command them to release it. So we're teaching him that he's getting this little cube of cheese every time he meets my expectations. So all training sessions down the road will be much easier once he knows that he is going to get a food reward for performing. And then another thing that we're going to do today is we're going to start acclimating the dog to the idea that I'm going to touch his ear every time I ask him to retrieve something. I'm not going to apply any pressure today. I'm not going to pinch his ear. I'm not going to force him to retrieve anything with pressure, but I want him to get used to just every time my hand is lightly grazing his ear or about to grab his ear, that he is going to be asked to retrieve something. So we're introducing this physical cue that will again make training later on much easier, so that eventually when we need to apply some pressure, we should be able to just touch his ear. He knows what's coming at that point. He knows he's going to be asked to retrieve. We're just trying to make everything as easy for the dog as possible. And then our fourth training objective today is just to reinforce a lot of basic obedience. You'll find throughout the force fetch process that we're going to work a lot on sit and heel and stay, implied or not. So hopefully you've already brushed up on a lot of that basic obedience before starting force fetch with your dog today, and you'll notice how many times I tell him to sit. So when we start with this, I always start with the dog in a sitting position, because when we're in the field, eventually as I send him for retrieves, whether it's a blind retrieve, a search behind a duck, a stillburn in the woods, I'm always going to start with him at a sit and then send him with a fetch command from there. So therefore I'm going to make him sit every time I give him a dummy. And then eventually that will become very habitual for him, where again, we're just trying to give your dog as many physical cues as possible for them to understand the task that they have at hand. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pick the easiest dummy there is, which is just a little canvas dummy. It's easier for the dogs to hold. And you can see that I've got him positioned so that my left hand has a hold of his leash and it's close to his right ear. And then with my right hand, I'm holding the dummy out in front of him. You can see he's interested, but again, we haven't worked on this previously, so it'll be interesting to see what he does. I'm going to say hold, give him just a beat of a second, just like you would anytime you ask your dog anything else. And then if he doesn't immediately grab it, which he's not going to because he hasn't learned this, then I'm going to just gently open his mouth for today by sticking my thumb in between his premolars and his molars. That'll help just force his mouth open, because he'll be biting on his own, or on the skin of his mouth if he doesn't. And then I'm going to place the dummy in there. He's probably going to resist that a little bit, not just, again, having not gone through this, he's going to be a little uncomfortable with me just holding the dummy in his mouth. I'm going to keep one finger right under the chin so that he can't drop the dummy. Again, we're just trying to help the dog succeed. And as soon as he's calm and is not struggling for even just a split second, I'm going to give a release command, which for me, I usually just say drop, which will allow him to drop the dummy and then immediately give him a piece of cheese. So once we get going, I'm going to do this in quick succession, but that's what you should be looking for, is we're getting the dog accustomed to just holding a dummy, and then as soon as they're calm and just relaxed and holding it as they've been asked, then I'll give the release command and he'll get the reward. Enzo, you ready, buddy? All right, let's sit up. Ready? So I'm gonna hold his ear, that's all, and fetch. He doesn't know what to do, so I just pried his mouth open. Oh, good boy. Drop. Good job! All right, so I left my hands on his muzzle because I wanted him to succeed in holding it. Eventually you'll be able to take your hands off. You just smelled the cheese. But we'll keep doing this more and more and just extend the amount of time that he's holding the dummy. And really within a couple days, they should be reaching for the dummy. Super excited to grab it because they know they'll get cheese. Ready? Fetch. Good boy. Hold. Drop. Yeah, good job, buddy. I think it's super important to use a ton of positive reinforcement too. I think a lot of people see force fetch as this really negative thing, and it's something actually that I enjoy almost more than any other training. You form such a strong bond with your dog, and it's where they really get to see that you're going to give them a ton of positive reinforcement. He's going to get cheese, he's going to get praise verbally, he's going to get physical praise with the petting. Should be a really fun experience for him. Ready? Fetch. So again, just holding his ear. Good. Hold. Drop. Yes, good job. So I did just give a little a verbal correction there. So he just started to jostle it a little bit in his mouth. He started to open it, and so I just did that, You can use that or no, whatever you typically would say to your dog to discourage them from a behavior. And he responded to it, then he held it nice and calmly, so then he got his reward. Ready? Do you want it? You can see how he's focused, looking at the dummy. He's starting to put the pieces together already. Fetch. So I'm holding his ear, I'm not pinching it, I'm just using my right thumb to open his mouth so that he can hold the dummy. And I'm trying to take one hand off. Drop. Good. So I'm already reducing pressure. Initially I was holding his muzzle shut with a hand on top and on bottom of his muzzle, but as I'm getting more confident in him learning how to do this, you can see I was removing one hand and just keeping the one underneath. So if we can get to, at the end of this first session of him holding it with me taking both hands entirely away without him dropping it, you know, that would be a really successful day one of force fetch. Ready? Fetch. Good. I am pulling his lips up. I don't want him to bite on his lips while he's holding the dummy. Good boy. I would prefer him to be facing me as he drops it. Drop. Good boy! So when he was looking away like that, he was holding it for a second without me holding his muzzle, but I didn't want to quite reward him yet, because eventually we want him to come in and sit with a retrieve and hopefully look up to you. I mean, if you recall what it writes in the, or what it says in the VZPO and the VGPO, or test regulation booklets, it says the dog is supposed to present game. And to me, that means the dog sits in front of you and then is holding it for you, waiting for you to grasp it from their hand. And as judges, we're always trying to note the cooperation of a dog. And one little thing one area where we can see cooperation quite clearly is the dog happy to bring game to you? You know, are they making eye contact with you? Are they pleased with themselves? Are they happy to be working for you? So we can kind of start to condition the dog to have this type of behavior by having him looking at me as we take the dummy out, and that's when he gets cheese. All right, buddy, you want to keep going? All right, come on, sit. Ready? Fetch. Good. Hold. Good job. So if they drop it like that, we're not going to give a hard physical correction. We're just going to make sure they're sitting. And we're going to put it back in their mouth. They do not get cheese unless they hold it until you give the release command. Good boy. Such a good boy. Hold. Good. Drop. Drop. Good job! Such a good boy. That was really nice. I actually kind of like it when they get a little sticky there, where he was a little apprehensive about dropping it because he didn't want to get in trouble. So you'll see that they pick up on that pretty quickly. You can see he's already holding it. I like to get in the habit too of scratching their chest as they're holding it. On test day, they'll be required to hold the piece of game, you know, for a maximum score until you grab it from them. So I like to work ahead a little bit, where in training I like to make things a little harder. So when he brings game in, when all my dogs bring game in, I often praise them and scratch their chest before I take the game out of their mouth, just so they're not trying to anticipate that they can drop something early. Test day is usually the only time that I ever just grab something directly out of the dog's mouth. In training, I almost always scratch them on the chest or give them a quick shoulder pat, you know, some sort of physical touch before they release it. So on test day, they're almost surprised when I take it right away, but it helps so that they never drop anything. All right, ready, buddy? Fetch. Good. He's turning away a little bit. He's just a little tired with the exercise. Hold. Good boy. So again, I'm going to hold his ear, open his mouth. Good job. Make sure you give a ton of positive reinforcement. Sit up. Sit. All right, come on, sit. Fetch. Good. Such a good boy. Since he's been struggling, I'm going to help him a little more here. I'm going to keep a hand here. We want him to be successful. Good job, buddy. Good job. Good. Drop. Yes, good boy. So when they're successful, let them know. That was really good. He worked through being a little ready to end the session. He's just a little tired, you know, this is morning nap time usually, but keep working through it. And that's why we only do 5 or 10 minutes at a time. Like, this is plenty for our first session. He did pretty well with this dummy, so I only used one. Some dogs, if they're kind of struggling with one, I will just switch to another dummy. That kind of helps sometimes, just to hit the reset button, try to teach them with something different. But again, don't overdo it. That is a wonderful first day for a dog. So we'll call it a day there, and we'll pick this back up tomorrow, and we'll start in kind of the same spot. And then usually within a few days, I'll start applying pressure to the ear if they haven't already figured out to reach for the dummy. But again, there's no need to push them hard. This should be a fun experience for you, where you really get to develop a one-on-one bond with your dog. They get tons of praise, tons of reward. Always want to make sure that you use way more positive reinforcement than any negative reinforcement. Enzo, sit. So again, I would encourage you, once you get this far with your dog, to just pick up the other video series. And I'll provide a link in the description for this, so you can see a whole video series on me walking through every single force fetch session with our previous dog. Good job, buddy. Such a good boy. Yeah.